Good evening and welcome to everyone who's watching us on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. It's nice to see you with us this evening. And also like to welcome my co-host, Kieran Van Sweden. Hello, Kieran. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Yes, I'm very well. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. I know you're less busy than you have been the last couple of months, so it's great that we can get you on live. And I've got to say sorry again for getting the timings wrong with our interview with Dirk, because I know you're really keen, and I was really keen to come to have you on and asking a few more questions. And unfortunately, I got all the timings with Europe and the UK mixed up. So unfortunately, we didn't have Kieran's input into the interview, but hopefully we can hear from you after the interview with Dirk. So thanks everyone for joining us. Kieran, anything you want to cover or chat about before we play?
Well, I'm desperate to get your take on the Spanish elections.
Yeah, it's like I kind of described it as an election here. It's a bit like foreplay, right? And it's just the first election, and it's like kind of teasing and seeing where everything goes, and then there's another election. This is what happened. This is what happened last time, before we ended up with a government that was able to, a party that was able to form a government. So I think we're in a similar situation again. I think we kind of we carry on for a few months until there's another election. I'd be surprised even if they take the posters down that are out across. I can see a few from a window. It'll probably another one in a few months. But interestingly, Vox, the right-wing party, lost about 20 seats, and the Socialists, who are actually a true kind of socialist government here, who actually enact socialist policies, gained a few seats as well, which is really interesting considering they're the party in power. So yeah, really interesting. Not as bad as a lot of people hoped, but it'd just be really, really, really great if we could actually get a government formed before the end of the year.
Yeah, and that Socialist Party is also accepting of the nationalist movements in Catalonia and the Basque Country, and I understand Galicia as well in the north. So that's a different set of socialism than we've got here in the UK.
Yeah, they're more accepting. I wouldn't say they're accepting, but they're certainly more accepting. But we can have conversations, but we still can't dissolve the Spanish constitution, which means basically independence is out of the question, but we can do some other stuff. So certainly a lot less forthright than the parties of the right are with independence. But no, not much scope for independence parties here following the election results.
So interestingly, I've just read, I think today, that Heinz and Unilever are possibly being investigated into price setting activities. So that's pretty relevant for this interview today, where I think that Dirk Ents is going to deconstruct inflation from being the mythical creature which some people perceive it to be.
No, that's interesting, and we cover it a little bit in the interview, but there's a lot of research that's gone into the prices that a lot of companies have been charging in terms of profit, and basically in terms of profiteering at the moment. I would have loved to go into the construction of how companies create their prices, which is incredibly interesting. It's microeconomics, which is kind of what I'm studying at the moment, and I'd love to do that in a separate episode, because we don't really fully understand what drives prices. And the mainstream and most people will think that it's just supply and demand. It's the companies responding to the demand, and that's how prices are set. And I would love to kind of explain and discuss actually how prices are set. And I'm sure for those people who are in businesses or run a business, worked in a business, they're really clear that businesses don't just look out the window, see what people are willing to pay and charge that price. So it's a really interesting part of economics, which I'd love us to cover after the summer. We get into a little bit on that, but not as much as I'd hoped. But it's a really fascinating interview we have with Dirk. We've got 40 minutes. We cover a lot of stuff here, a lot of inflation, a lot of central bank discussion. I really hope you enjoy the interview. Please stay with us. We'll be back on at the end to hear your questions and also any of your comments. I hope you all enjoy this. We'll see you in about 45 minutes.
Okay.
Well, hello, Dirk Ents. Thanks very much for joining us in SCOTONOMICS. You're here to talk principally about inflation and to kind of describe and give us a lot more insight into what's causing inflation at the moment, what historically has caused inflation and why things might be a little bit different, and also to look at the different views on inflation. So the best place I think to start is just really to talk about what's causing inflation at the moment. If we look at, let's say, kind of post-COVID, most countries have experienced inflation at a higher rate than they have for, maybe even a couple of decades before. Would you like to give us some insight as to what's causing inflation at the moment?
But first, thanks for having me, Kyrene and William. It's always a pleasure to be on SCOTONOMICS. Well, what is inflation anyway? I think the first thing to note is that inflation is connected to consumer prices, so the prices that we pay for the goods and services that we consume, and it's in the end it is a kind of statistic, so it's looking backwards. It's looking at prices that we have paid already, and the question, of course, is then why do prices go up? So why do we have inflation? So one price going up is not inflation. So you need to have a whole basket of consumer goods, and if they go up in price, and then the whole shopping cart full of your consumer goods, which includes also rent and, for example, petrol or gas for your car, if that goes up in price, then we talk about inflation. And what low rates of inflation feel like, we all know from the past. So there we had in many countries, US, European countries, but also in Asia, very low rates of inflation in most countries. But now we have higher rates of inflation, and these rates of inflation that are higher are a symptom mostly of energy prices that have increased quite a lot in 2021-22. So I would always argue that inflation, as Randy Ray always says, money is always innocent. So inflation is always the result of price setting, mostly by companies, but also the governments. They also set some prices. And in this particular case, the energy prices were very low in the beginning of the pandemic. I remember that in April 2020, because there were lots of lockdowns, there was very little demand for oil, and the oil price was negative even for a short time. So in April 2020, you would buy a barrel of oil on the market, and they would basically give you some French fries with it to go. So that's how cheap it was. So because you need to pay for storing oil, the capacity was already full. Oil tankers were loaded up, and they had to get rid of the oil. And that's why that happened. And that was also when I remember that the gas price was very cheap in Germany, for example. I think it was roughly €1 a liter. And then it was only a couple of months later, at least that's what it feels like, it was €2 a liter. And that is because these energy prices have rebounded. And they rebounded, I think, because the oil cartel, OPEC, they probably cut production, and they wanted to make sure that they have a positive oil price, because otherwise you will not have a profit. So then the Ukraine war also happened. So Russia invaded Ukraine, and I think that is also a part of the story, because it kind of meant that Germany was looking for alternatives to gas, to natural gas that it imported from Russia, and that drove energy prices up some more. So that's what happened. And inflation is a symptom. So of course, when the oil price goes up, we see it at the pump. So when we fill our cars with gas, and also when we create fertilizer for agriculture, we also use a lot of energy for that. So that's also part of the thing. Once this increase in prices starts to happen, then of course there will be other companies who have no increase in costs, but they increase their prices anyway because they think they have the market power to do that. So this would be kind of profiteering from this kind of general rise in prices. And then what is the newest kind of thing is that companies try to keep the level of profits constant. And even if costs are rising by, let's say, 20% and wages are not among them, then of course they would also increase their price, and it would kind of show up as another contributor to the rate of inflation. So I think the main thing to understand is that if we import energy in whatever country you are, if you import energy from a foreign country and you pay higher prices, there's nothing you can do at the central bank to make this neutralize this. Okay, so you will be having a loss of purchasing power of your own currency. And if you are an exporting country, then of course you gain currency and you will be able to purchase more stuff from outside of your country.
So the increase in the price of oil, that was reflected in a whole host of products, because so many products use energy as part of the transformation process, either transport from oil and gas, or electricity and gas for generation to produce or transform those products for the market. So you're saying that the prices were rising generally, not exclusively down to the rise in energy prices, but in huge part to rise in energy prices, and that affected that wide spread of products.
Yeah, so it's a it's a kind of oil price shock, and then you have these knock-on effect or second round effects that the higher oil prices, they kind of move through the economy, and at the very end, even the beer price has increased because the ingredients for beer, the beer price will also come up because you use agricultural products. And for agricultural production, which is industrialized in our countries, you also need fuel and to create fertilizer and all these kind of things, and to run machines, to drive the lorries around. So yes, there's lots of energy used in agriculture, and that is why also in agricultural prices you have oil prices reflected. Yeah.
You mentioned the role of the central bank in kind of defending or taming inflation, and what you've said there is that if you've got to pay more for oil and you're dependent on oil, you will have inflation. So are we kind of defenseless when we're importing a lot of energy? And then secondly, if we aren't defenseless, what can central banks do about it?
Yeah, I mean, it depends a little bit on your economy. So if, for example, in northern Sweden, they generate lots of energy, and it's mostly connected with water. Okay, so they have hydropower. And they don't have a network which reaches to southern Sweden, for example. So if there's lots of energy in northern Sweden, it will be cheap and you cannot export it. Okay, so it's kind of local. And that's, of course, something which is kind of not normal in our globalized world. Normally we have commodities and you can ship them around the globe. But it's kind of odd that some parts of energy generation, they are part of local networks. And then in northern Sweden, of course, the energy price during the whole month and years of this kind of crisis, it stayed low. In southern Sweden, the energy price went up because southern Sweden is connected to the European Union by the networks that go through Denmark. And they were exporting energy because they got a good price. So yes, I mean, you cannot protect yourself from the rise in import prices. I mean, you can spend more money, but that means, of course, that at some point, if you are a firm or if you are a household, at some point you will run down your net wealth and you will run down your cash if you want, and your expenditures will exceed your income. And at some point you will not be managing to sustain this kind of level of consumption. And then at some point you will basically sell your car, for example, because commuting is just too expensive, or you will turn down the heating because you can't afford to pay the bill. So that, of course, is a very big problem sometimes, that the people are affected like this by higher energy prices. So what bites them is not inflation per se, that's just a statistical concept, but what bites them really is the higher energy prices. So to some extent, we should have talked about higher energy prices and an energy crisis. And instead, we talked about inflation, which I think was the wrong choice. So central banks, they could have said, well, you know, it's just an exogenous shock. Energy prices have gone up, and there's nothing we can do about it. For example, the ECB, they have kind of updated their monetary policy strategy in 2021. And I think that somewhere hidden in these kind of documents, you find something that really says that the ECB should stay out of the game if the cause of inflation is a shock in energy prices. It makes a lot of sense, right? And that's also what the ECB did. So they were waiting and doing nothing and not doing anything for a long time. The same with the Bank of England, by the way. And then there was a meeting, I think, in the United States. And after that meeting, everybody said, yes, okay, we have to hike rates. So we have to increase interest rates in order to bring inflation down. So yeah, that's a little bit odd from our perspective, because when you think about it, higher interest rates just means that the costs of business are rising. Okay, so if I were a business and I would be investing in, I don't know, creating new cars and new models and then building those cars, I mean, there's a market for my electric cars, right? I'm a producer for cars, and now there's a huge demand for electric cars. Why would I not want to invest? I mean, yes, the interest rate is now higher, but I can just increase the price of my electric cars that I'm selling, and my competitors will have to do the same. So from a logical point of view, the argument that if you increase prices, then you have a fall in the rate of investment, that's a very weak argument. Okay, so most people who are in business, they will tell you that basically prices are set looking at costs, and if costs are going up, they just increase price. So, well, the cost of capital, if you want, is the interest rate that you pay when you borrow money from the bank, and that's also part of your costs. And this is also what we have seen in many countries, in the United States, but also in Germany, that even, well, you could say even though interest rates are up, private investment is still strong, but I would say it's probably the other way around, because if you increase the rate of interest, you will have more interest rate payments to the bondholders. Okay, so there's lots of public debt, as we call it. So the governments issue government bonds because they are forced to do that by the rules that we have in our monetary systems. Then you get an interest rate. If the interest rate set by the central bank is positive, or if it's zero, you get basically zero if you're a bondholder. And now that interest rates have increased, you add a lot of money to those people who are holding those government bonds, right? I mean, that's an increase in private sector income. And even if they just spend a little bit of that money that they get, we would have an increase in aggregate demand, in the demand for goods and services that are purchased. So I think that the governments, that the central banks are kind of relying on the wrong kind of monetary theory. They believe that interest rates increases are somehow increasing the unemployment rate, because they think that investment is down when interest rates go up. And if investment is down, there's more unemployment. So more people out of work, which means there's less wage pressures in your economy, and there's less demand for goods and services. So you have also an effect on prices, which is more direct. And that's what the new Keynesian theory is about. And there was a paper by Larry Summers, who was an economic counsel to President Barack Obama, for example, and Olivier Blanchard, who was at the IMF. And they wrote a paper pretty much a year ago, and they said, well, the only way to bring the rate of inflation down in the United States is to increase the rate of unemployment. Okay, so this is very clear cut, right? I mean,
there's no hiding. There's no hiding now, is there? There's no pretending that raising interest rates to tame inflation by increasing unemployment is what central banks are trying to do.
Yeah, and that's a very dubious strategy, because, I mean, you're kind of throwing a lot of workers under the bus so that the rest of us can have and can enjoy low rates of inflation. I mean, that's a very bad idea of distributing the costs of adjustment. I mean, you kick some people out of work, and then they're unemployed, and they carry all the fiscal costs, if you want. So they have a big problem, because we still have societies in which we rely on income from work mostly. So that's really not nice. But also it seems that it doesn't work, because what has happened, okay, if you go back to July 2022 and you look at the employment rate now, employment in the US is higher, like lots higher than in 2022 in July, but the inflation rate is down. Okay, so this, of course, according to Larry Summers and Olivier Blanchard, that is not what should have happened. But that, of course, means that for us as economists, we have to explain reality. Okay, so if the theory predicts something and then it doesn't come true and the opposite in fact happens, then we should go back to the drawing board, and we should say, okay, let's leave these theories, let's leave them apart, and let's develop new theories. So we already have done that. So there is already a lot of theory that can explain how inflation works, and that inflation is a symptom of changes in costs mostly, including labor costs, mostly in energy costs. I think these are the two main drivers in normal times. But right now, it's probably profits that are also very much a driver. And as I said, in some societies like in Austria, Norway, also the rents that we pay, they increased by quite a lot. I think by 25% in 2 years in Austria, roughly, and also roughly the same numbers in Norway. So even the central banks are taking note, and they say, well, most of the increase in the rate of inflation is probably due to rent increases, which in those countries apparently are connected with or indexed with inflation, so that the landlord can raise the rent if inflation goes up.
That's a fascinating perspective there, and what I wanted to add to that was, not only is the policy not working, but if it does work, you're making more people unemployed, and those people in most Western societies are kind of victimized for being unemployed. And it's almost like you should find a job, you should work harder. And I don't think a lot of people are aware that the central banks are trying to make these people unemployed. So you mentioned some countries who are having issues around high rents leading into inflation, and you mentioned the northern states in Germany. At the moment, you'll be aware that the inflation in the UK is the highest in Europe, and inflation in Spain is the lowest in Europe. Would you like to kind of look at those two different approaches, different economies, and perhaps help us understand why those inflation rates are so different?
I think what Spain basically did, they have a left government, so it's social democrats or socialists, as they call them there, plus Podemos, which is like a party of the left. So they have introduced a lot of things to help normal people cope with the situation. They have introduced, for example, a minimum income, which did not exist before because they don't have unemployment benefits for more than 12 months. So that made a lot of sense. They have instituted also a maximum price for energy that was generated in Spain itself. So if you produce energy inside the country, there was a price cap. So I think that was very helpful. And of course, it's kind of, from an economist, it's kind of a second best solution. So of course, theoretically, prices on markets should be set by everybody according to costs. But the thing is, of course, that this cannot be expected. Okay, so you have profit maximizing companies, you have private companies in the energy production sector. There's a shortage of energy, and we don't need a price signal to signal that to us. Okay, so we know about this.
You're aware of that.
And then of course you have these kind of monopoly situations where the energy suppliers, they can basically charge any price they want because people need that energy. They need to heat their homes. They need the industry needs the energy to run the factories. And I mean, it would be exploitation really if you would see the prices rising, because as I said, the price signals are something which is generally useful in an economy to signal scarcity if that's the problem. But in that case, again, it was very open and obvious to everybody to see that energy was scarce and that there was a problem. So I think the Spanish did it rather well. I think they supported the population also by other means. And the UK
the other two things I'll add to Spain was there was windfall taxes on energy company and banks. Yeah. So they were saying if you're making excess profits at this time, we'll take them off you. And that's a great incentive for people to reduce their prices if they know they're not going to make that profit at all. And then the other thing that they did was cap rents. And it was amazing that it was brought in such a short period of time, around about a month's consultation. And they're allowed any regional government to decide which zones they can have as stressed zones. And if the average rent is above 30% of the average wage, the local government can determine that is an area of stressed income and can cap rents. So, that's an incredible proactive stance for a government to take, and it is absolutely, in Barcelona that was introduced just at the start of June, and so there are areas that have been deemed stressed areas where the market rate that everyone has to charge has to be below a certain amount, and that was set by a panel effectively set by the government. So those things have had a big impact, and I think the inflation rate at the start of July was around about 2.3% or something like that in Spain. It was back to, I actually think it was below the ECB's target rate, so I think it might have been below 2%.
Yeah, it was below 2%. So I mean, we already go into the other direction. I mean, if it's below 2%, the ECB is supposed to move interest rates down and not up, of course. Of course, it's not happening everywhere in the Eurozone, not yet at least. But I mean, I think the UK just didn't do the right kind of policy. So I think they did not have this kind of windfall profits tax. There was nothing with rents, and they just took a hands-off approach.
They took, as you would imagine, they took a very hands-off approach in leaving the market to try and sort this out.
Yeah, so in the United Kingdom, I think the government shifted responsibility for inflation to the central bank and said, well, it's an inflation problem. It has nothing to do with us. So let's let the Bank of England do their job, and they will start to raise rates. And that will somehow lead to inflation being lower than before, which didn't work. But I think to some extent it's a political thing that, I mean, for the rich, I mean, if you own government bonds, it's risk-free. And if you get a nice interest rate, then of course it's nice for you. I mean, it's unearned income in a way. So of course there's an incentive for lobbyists, for the rich, or those people who are having government bonds, and lots of them, like billions of government bonds. Of course there's a lot of pressure to increase interest rates there. So if there's a conservative government and they prefer to do policy only in favor of the let's say the top 10% in terms of income, and they believe that the poor are poor because they're either unproductive or lazy, then of course it kind of makes sense from a political perspective to not say that, but instead just play a political game and say, look, I shift all the responsibility to the central bank and they will take care of it. What you could have done, of course, also in the United Kingdom is what the Spaniards did, also what the German government did, is to help workers to cope with the crisis. I think also this movement, Enough is Enough, is very pronounced in Britain. It has a lot of people who are becoming a part of that program or that movement. And I think it's also because of the lack of policy response that helps people. And now the result is in. I mean, higher interest rates do not really fight inflation. And that was kind of obvious all along. We have also evidence in the Eurozone where we have countries like the Czech Republic and the Slovak Republic, which used to be one country, Czechoslovakia. They are now two countries since the early 1990s. And they also figured out that they would have to have a monetary divorce. So they had Czechoslovakian crowns, and then they had Czech crowns and Slovak crowns, and then they had Czech crowns and euros because Slovakia joined the Eurozone a couple of years ago. But the countries both have more or less the same or very similar industrial structure. So both have lots of car industry, and I think industry by GDP is roughly a little bit more than 20%. So it was an interesting experiment because the Czechs increased interest rates from summer 2021 onwards, whereas we did that in the Eurozone only from summer 2022 onwards. So you could, of course, say, well, because the Czechs started raising interest rates faster, so earlier, so they were at 5% before we even started in the Eurozone, then, of course, you would say that inflation, which was roughly the same in summer 2021 in both countries, and traditionally is almost the same anyway in both countries, you would probably expect to see that Czech inflation is lower than Slovak inflation, but the opposite was the case. So Czech inflation was consistently higher than Slovak inflation, and I think just last month the two have been identical again after almost 2 years of divergence where Czech inflation was higher than Slovak inflation, and that also points us towards the empirical fact that moving interest rates up does not lead to lower rates of inflation. It does lead to banking troubles. I mean, we have all seen what happened with Silicon Valley Bank in the United States. So, of course, if you raise interest rates high enough and you have mark to market, for example, when it comes to government bonds, so that the bond prices are falling, because at high interest rates it's very attractive to buy new government bonds which pay you, I don't know, 4 or 5%, but the old government bonds which carry 0% interest rates, they are very unattractive, so their prices are falling. And that could be, of course, one of the effects of higher interest rates, that you kind of crash your banking system. But that's also not what the central bank is supposed to do. They normally have the target of financial stability. So I think central banks should really rethink the way they do monetary policy.
Yeah. I think I agree completely with you. And I think in any other environment or any other discipline, there's enough evidence to suggest that the framework is not is not working, is not predicting what's supposed to happen, and then it's not dealing with what is actually happening. You know, I think there's a huge amount of evidence in that. You said that these decisions around interest rates can be political, and I think a lot of people think that as soon as the central bank was effectively made independent, you know, as it was in the UK in the 90s, that you have these people who are just there making the best possible decision for the economy as a whole, and they're not influenced by anyone, and they're making these decisions really clearly to try and benefit as many people in the country as possible. And what you're saying is, well, every decision that's made has a political aspect to it. And as most people who follow the show will know, in the Monetary Policy Committee in the UK, the governor is appointed by the government. There's 4 members who are appointed by the government on rotation, and then there's 4 members of staff. So the central bank actually has a majority of people who are appointed by the government, and they're all people from the kind of economic orthodoxy. The majority of them are Oxford or Cambridge educated. You know, they've all went to the London School of Economics. So they're all very similar type of people who are likely to make a decision based on their experiences and their kind of institutional support. And they're making decisions that they're only really able to make a certain set and certain type of decisions because of the framework that's built up to support it. So the idea that they're truly independent and they're likely to make decisions, I think is similar to that framework. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that that's not actually the case.
Yeah, I mean, independence is something which we really don't have when it comes to central banks. As you said, the leaders in the central bank, like the political leaders there, central bank president, members of the board, they are normally put into those positions because politicians put them there. And these are the people then in charge of monetary policy. So that is not what we mean when we say independent. Also, the government could at any time, they could create a new law and change the law, for example, of the central bank, so that the central bank has to do something which it doesn't want to do. I remember that in 2020, I think it was Boris Johnson who asked the Bank of England to let him spend money without issuing gilts. Okay, so no government bonds, just spend money on behalf of the government. And then the Bank of England said, well, we don't think it's a good idea. Then on the weekend, there was an article in the Financial Times where the Bank of England said, well, in times of crisis, maybe it's not such a bad idea. And on Monday, they said, well, okay. Okay, so, I mean, the government is really in the stronger position here because they can change the law regarding the central bank with a simple majority. And if you are the government, by definition, you have a simple majority, right? So that is why when it comes push to shove, that the central banks, they are not independent. They are creatures of the law. They are part of the state, just as the government, and the central bank cannot change the law and they cannot change the government. So it's in a weak position. And yes. I think it's just a talking point to outsource decisions also about distribution and things that affect the level of inequality, to outsource that to a technocratic institution and say, well, it's them doing it and they are kind of experts. And we have kind of seen that this kind of idea of central banking has reached its limits. So as you said, the central bankers form a very closed club. They come from the same places. They follow the same kind of theories, and they're not really known for critical thinking, right? So
they wouldn't get the position if they were the type of person who goes against the grain and who speaks up against the conventional wisdom.
Well, I think the official theory, the new Keynesian theory, is just about the question of private investment. So for them, higher interest rates reduce private investment, and it's not a matter of inequality for them, at least. So I think that the new Keynesians are kind of honest in terms of the theory. So they really do believe that higher interest rates lead to lower rates of investment. I think by now they also have realized that it doesn't work. So there's a paper in 2020 published by Michael Woodford, who's one of the leading New Keynesians. He has a book out, Interest and Prices, which is like the Bible of the New Keynesians. And he said in 2020, which was also published in the American Economic Review in 2022, if I'm not mistaken, he said that sometimes monetary policy doesn't work and it cannot create the kind of aggregate demand that you need to move the economy towards full employment. So even the New Keynesians have argued in 2020 and in the pandemic that we should increase government spending in order to bring the economy back towards full employment and price stability. So I think that the effect of interest rates on inequality, I mean, central banks have been doing some research that started roughly 10 years ago. So when Piketty broke with his book, then it was also possible for central banks to discuss the consequences of their policy. But I would always say that I think that inequality is the result of the state letting people get away with really, really high incomes. So for me, the problem is not interest rates. So yes, of course, it's unearned income if you have an interest rate of 5% and you have no risk because you hold a government bond. So yes, the rich get richer, and if the interest rate is higher than wage growth, then also it's an increase in inequality. So I agree that we should have low interest rates. I mean, probably like interest rates set at the inflation target or set at zero, somewhere around there. I think that's probably a good idea to do that. But inequality is more the result of the financial markets and the lack of regulation that we have. So in the United States in 2020, we had hedge fund managers, and the 25 most successful of them in terms of financial income, they earned $37 billion. And that's not money they earned because they didn't work for that. It just fell into their lap because of the lax financial regulation. So it's completely unthinkable to have a person working for 1 year and then earning $1 billion. $1 billion. What for? I mean, how productive is that person? What did he or she do? And there's no way that we can have a high tax rate and then tax that money back. It's not going to happen politically. So I think the inequality debate has to some extent be disconnected from the interest rate debate. So I don't think that monetary policy is behind the rise in inequality, but rather it's the rise of the financial sector and the lack of regulation, plus of course the weakness of unions and normal people in the sense that workers are struggling now to make a decent income that gives them a good life. I think that's the reason there. But definitely central banks with their monetary policy are not helping, not the economy as a whole, but also in terms of inequality, their monetary policy now harms those who are at the bottom of the income generation.
What role have profits played in the particular bout of inflation that we've had over the last 12 months? And where is the evidence that companies are profiteering?
I think there's empirical evidence now that profits are up. I think that much is clear. So we know that profits are up. Even the IMF says that, or the ECB. And the question is, of course, why is it up? So when we think about pricing, we normally think that companies more or less know what their costs are. And then they just add a markup to those costs, which is their profit. And this is how they generate a price. So if there's something that costs £100 to produce, and then they think about the price of that product, they probably say, well, let's make 20%. So they add £20, and then the price will be £122 before taxes. That's, I think, kind of reasonable to assume that most companies price in that way. And they don't care about the costs, whether it's interest rate costs or wage costs or anything else, doesn't matter. So if your costs are increasing and you are a company, maybe your energy prices are increasing by £10. So that means you increase your price by £10 in order to keep your profit stable. So you still have maybe £20 of a profit. But if you want to have 20% of a profit, then of course you have to increase your price even more. Okay, and that is why the profit share probably is rising when companies are trying to keep their profit share constant on the individual level. It's a strange effect, but the main problem for most people is that wages are not growing like prices. And that means, of course, that you have less and less purchasing power as a worker. And the companies they probably say, well, we just do what we always do. We did not increase our profits. That's their individual take, because they say, well, we always take 20%. But because the rise of non-wage costs in their production, that is leading to prices that in the end do increase the profits faster than the wages, even though the companies didn't want to do it. It's a macroeconomic phenomenon of microeconomic decisions, if you want, which is creating a bit of a strange result.
Yeah, and as you said, both the IMF and the ECB only last week or a couple of weeks ago said that profits were high and were part of inflation. If that is so obvious, why would we have someone, like the chairman or the governor of the Bank of England saying workers have to show wage restraint, but at no point has said that companies have to show profit restraint? What would be the rationale for that?
Well, I mean, you already mentioned this. I think it's mostly groupthink. So that's. I mean, they just know new Keynesian economics, and they probably don't know anything else. They probably did not study post-Keynesian economics, MMT, or Wickselian economics. So that's the metaphors that they know. That's the kind of job that they believe they have to do. I mean, for them, they believe that the central bank really has to protect societies from overspending, and probably for them it's really the workers who are the main problem, because that's also what the history tells us. I mean, 60s and 70s we had strong unions, and we also had energy price crisis, oil price shocks, but the workers were strong enough to counter price increases by wage increases that were even higher, and that did increase a wage price spiral. So this can happen. Well, I mean, this is a distributional struggle, but the central banks kind of decided that struggle and created more unemployment by raising interest rates, which kind of crashed the economy in the 80s. But I'm not too sure about that, to be honest, because I mean, raising interest rates probably creates financial troubles more than problems with aggregate demand. But definitely, I remember that in the 70s and 80s. The unions were broken in the UK, and co-workers, the miners. So British Leland did not exist anymore. So Britain kind of deindustrialized as a result of that. So there was a distributional struggle over income, and Britain deindustrialized and now has this big financial sector centered in London. Probably it was not a good result for most British people. I mean, for them, the amount of good jobs probably decreased. And you can see this really huge inequality now between London and the rest of the country. But these things are very complex. And just to talk just about inflation it doesn't do it justice.
Yeah, I think that is a really important point. I mean, we've covered quite a few things in our conversation today, and what you often hear in the press is that inflation is a very simple thing. And, the model says that in the long term, the business cycle will level out. So the only cause for inflation can be wages. So therefore, you increase interest rates to slow down the economy and put more pressure on wages, and inflation falls. Now, that's a very simple story. And I think that's partly why it's so easy to believe, because as you and I know, simplicity is hard to dislodge by something that's a little bit more complicated. And any way we can approach this in the next bout of inflation, which I think is bound to happen, especially driven by the price shocks that we're going to have caused by the climate crisis, what can we do differently the next time?
Yeah, I think what we have to do is we have to understand inflation as a symptom, and always treat it as a symptom. Okay, so when you say inflation is up or above average, the next question always should be, okay, so which prices are we talking about here? Okay, so what is the price that has increased? Did wages go up, or did energy prices go up, or did rents go up? Let's talk about that. Let's talk about prices. Let's talk about price setting. Who were the actors? Private sector companies? Maybe was there a monopoly or something? Why was there no reaction to that? Normally, we believe that if we have markets, that if prices goes up, it signals scarcity, so quantity increases, and then you have an adjustment, so prices come down. So why is it not working in that sense? So if we treat inflation as a symptom. And then we get to this kind of question, so who's raising prices and why? I mean, it's a very logical question to as a follow-up question to the fact that inflation has increased. And I think most people will understand that question, and they will say, oh yeah, that's a good question. So which prices increased and why? And then you look at the costs and you look at the markup and so on. And I think that's something probably that we have also learned, how to discuss inflation. And I think next time around, we will always be heard, and there will be always more coverage of our position, because it's just so obvious that there's more than one kind of inflation. And yes, the textbooks are full of these kind of 60s, 70s inflations where you have a wage price spiral, but we haven't seen these kind of inflations for half a century. And even though we have this kind of demographic problem coming up, it's a very open question whether we get to return to this kind of labor scarcity that we had in the 50s and 60s in all these Western European countries. So I'm very optimistic that we have also learned a lesson here on how to talk about inflation, because I think there's this saying that every happy family is alike, but all the unhappy families are unhappy in their very own way. I think it's probably Tolstoy or Dostoevsky who said that originally, but I can only paraphrase it. I mean, there's a lot of societies which have 10% unemployment, but the question is why? And probably in Argentina, maybe you have also 10 or 20% unemployment, or in Turkey you have, inflation, or in Turkey you have 30 or 40% inflation. In the UK it's 10%, but it's not the same thing. There's different. There's different causes for these kind of inflations. So I think that's what we should discuss more going forward. And also central banks, I think, will change the way they discuss inflation, because otherwise, I mean, they talk a lot about reputation and signaling, but I mean, they have lost a lot of their reputation in the last 12 months, I would think, because first they did the right thing, doing nothing, then they did the wrong thing, raising rates, and now they don't stop raising rates. And inflation has already come down, and it's very obvious for most observers that it's the oil price. So if central banks really worry about expectations, they should change their mind and adjust to reality instead of playing around with the expectations some more. It doesn't make any sense.
At the moment, we're still focusing on how to deal with inflation. And I think what you're saying is actually the first thing you have to say is what is causing the inflation, and then look at that rather than going straight to what's the macro solution to these things that might be fairly obvious if we take another approach.
Raising interest rates with the idea of having less private investment, it's a strange reaction to a problem where you say the problem is that we have too much demand. It's what they say. Okay, so the central banks say we have too much demand for goods and services, and our solution is to cut the supply of goods and services. By increasing interest rates, we reduce investment, and that will lead down the road to less goods and services that you can purchase. That's not a solution. That makes the problem worse. Okay, so
Dirk, thanks very much for your time. It's been great having you on the show. We know that we've secured you for our Festival of Economics in Dundee in March. We'll be releasing our first lot of speakers and our tickets in August. So it's been great for us to have some time with you today. I'll see you before, but if not, look forward to welcoming you to their Festival of Economics in Dundee. Thanks for your time, Dirk.
Yeah, thanks, William, and I'm looking forward to see you.
I hope everyone enjoyed that. Really good comments and a few questions in the chat there. Karen, what's your thoughts on that?
So I think the Bank of England independence myth has been truly busted with this episode today. There's just so much about their thinking that is so much groupthink from what we can see. Also an interesting point that Dirk made about the huge profits those hedge funders were making in the States, and just how these people are making huge amounts of money without any productivity. The money is literally falling into their laps, and it really makes the point of why government needs to regulate that. This huge inequality that's being created it's really problematic, and not just on a societal level for wellness and for people and how they feel they're doing in society, but for the planet, because we know that these people with huge amounts of money are also very costly to the environment as well.
Yeah, the things that they consume are much more resource and emissions intensive than the purchases of people who have less wealth. So yeah, so really damaging. The article tomorrow we've got coming out in the National is around the amount of interest that the government is paying on its debt, and this kind of ties into inflation as well. Last month, the government paid 7.5 billion in interest payments, and this month it's 12.5 billion in interest payments. And since December, the figure's round about, I think it's about 65 billion has been paid to shareholders. And of course, this is because of the interest rate, which is set by the Bank of England being so high. So it's a huge amount of money. Now, you can argue that a lot of that money doesn't make its way into the economy and doesn't create much inflation. I think there's quite a strong argument for that. But even if we're not talking about inflation, if we're talking about inequality and actually looking at how that money is being spent, there's huge societal issues with that, and we're going to cover that in our article tomorrow. But it certainly leads into a little bit in inflation as well.
Yeah, and another interesting point as well that he brought up was that the Nauru madness and the low unemployment situation we have in the UK. So, the Bank of England's policy is this trying to keep people unemployed. But of course, in the UK just now, we have, we don't have a situation where people are stuck for looking for jobs. So how is it they think that that's going to work in this situation? It just doesn't make any sense.
We've got a question from Hashbury here. Did electricity prices being tied to the price of gas contribute to the cost of production? Yes, that was a huge issue in the UK. And when, as we said at the start, when we're looking at inflation, we really have to look at what leads to price rises, and the cost that companies had to pay was always going to lead into increases in prices. And in the kind of neoclassical models, this doesn't happen because competition enters the market and forces these companies to reduce their price to the kind of natural level, and those profits cannot be earned. So there's just clear evidence that equilibrium model isn't fit for purpose. It doesn't tell you anything about the real world, and the prices that were charged are fed through because the costs went up. It's irrelevant of how competitive or non-competitive a market was. So yes, it had a huge impact on the prices in the UK.
An interesting story as well about Sweden and the north of Sweden having a different energy system from the south of Sweden as well, which is kind of the opposite of what we have in the UK. So of course in the UK we've got a really poor system of energy distribution, and it's well documented how much more expensive it is per gigawatt hour here because of the way that the system is set up. And despite the fact that we're creating a lot of energy up in Scotland, that we're actually paying more for it. So that was an interesting take on what's happening in Sweden as well.
Yeah, I put into the comments there that Scotland, when it's independent, really has to focus lots of energy on making sure that it's energy sovereign and also food sovereign, because we're a small nation. And a small nation imports inflation much more than a larger nation. And we're in a real danger of importing a lot of inflation if we import energy and if we import food. And there's other few areas as well you can talk about, a lot of technologies. But we really need to focus on making sure we're energy and food sovereign if we want to try and make sure that we're much more able to defend ourselves against rising inflation. So I thought that was a point that we had to make. Well, thanks very much everyone for joining us this evening. In 2 weeks' time, we're undecided what we're going to show. We had an amazing session at the SCOTONOMICS Festival of Economics, where we had someone from America, Stuart McIntosh, talking about this new Scottish central bank. And we also had Tim Rideout speaking about what a central bank would do. And they had a very fiery discussion, which I would love to show you. So I'm going to ask Tim if he can join us, and we might show that session, because it really was fantastic. It only lasted about 20 minutes, but it was really, really intense. So we might show that in a couple of weeks. It's a brilliant session and loads to talk about. But we'd like you to join us on Wednesday, and we're joined by Lucas Bunce from the We All Alliance, who's going to help us look at some of the topics that we've covered in our newsletter, Economics of the Real World in the National. So you can join us at 2:30 on Wednesday on the SCOTONOMICS YouTube channel. It'd be great for us to see you there. If not, we'll see you in a couple of weeks. But thanks everyone for joining us. Please do like, comment, and share this episode. We think it's really important that people really understand that inflation is because people or organizations are putting up the prices, and we really need to focus on understanding why and who and what we can do about it. So thanks so much for joining us this evening. Bye for now.